Between 1944 and 1948, the USSR, under the strict rule of Marshal Stalin, established control over the countries on its borders. The eastern side of the Iron Curtain was under his total control and wasn't willing to let it go. Joseph Stalin raised the Soviet Union's status after his heroic involvement in World War II and used the global image his nation was being associated with to catapult his control on neighboring nations. By 1949, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, and Poland were under the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. For each of these countries, the system established by Stalin meant the establishment of one-party rule, nationalization of private enterprise, the imposition of Soviet-style five-year plans, and the integration of the economy of Eastern Europe with the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union had just emerged as a force to be reckoned with, Stalin's desire of overall control would not come as easily as he thought. During his imposition of specific economic and political systems, many challenges that directly threatened Soviet power arose, which the Soviets had to quickly repress in order to maintain power. Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev would all face turmoil during their regimes. Even after Stalin's death, Khrushchev as well as Brezhnev would make sure that the countries forming the Eastern Bloc stayed under Moscow's observant eye. Yugoslavia was the only country that was able to maintain their own appointed leader in power, since their leader, Marshal Tito, was strictly communist. Key nations would follow in desire to reach a more liberal and modern political system through manifestations, strikes, and riots. Unrest in East Germany followed Yugoslavia's turmoil. East Germany was dealing with a crisis in 1953 due to the mass migration of East Germans to the West through Berlin, as East German riots were triggered by the combination of relaxation of controls with continuing repression. The deputy Soviet Prime Minister Lavrentiy Beria suggested that the USSR should sell the German Democratic Republic to the West. The idea was not supported, since it was still believed possible to work towards a unified socialist Germany. However, Walter Ulbricht, leader of East Germany, was forced to take a conciliatory approach in his policy of forced collectivization of farms and socialization. Unfortunately, this softer approach came far too late, and the high production targets were not reduced. This created a dangerous situation, and on the 16th and 17th of June, workers in Berlin and elsewhere in East Germany rose up in revolt. The revolt started with a strike by East Berlin construction workers on the 16th of June 1953 and established itself as a widespread uprising against the German Democratic Republic government. Protesters were violently suppressed by tanks of the group of Soviet forces in Germany and by the Volkspolizei, also known as the People's Police. The protests were not easily stopped, and even after the 17th, there was a multitude of demonstrations in more than 500 towns and villages. The Politburo met at the party headquarters and dispatched to major cities in an effort to maintain political control. This was the first revolt in the Soviet sphere of influence, and even though it was quickly suppressed by the Red Army, the revolt was extremely embarrassing for the USSR. Beria was arrested and later executed, accused of being a Western agent. In addition, the idea of a friendly, neutral Germany was abandoned, and repression continued, as Ulbricht and Khrushchev concentrated on building up the German Democratic Republic as a separate state. In reviewing the Soviet Union's relations with Yugoslavia, Khrushchev did not intend to revise the USSR's relations with other satellite states. However, many satellite states saw Khrushchev's approach to Yugoslavia as a sign that he would accept them finding their own way in regards to communism. At the end of June 1956, Polish workers in the industrial city of Poznań revolted. The Polish communist Władysław Gomulka was brought back to political prominence as first secretary, without Khrushchev's support, and implemented a rapid de-Stalinization program. On October 19, 1956, Khrushchev flew to Warsaw, as Soviet military forces moved into intimidating positions. However, Gomulka refused to be intimidated by Khrushchev, even threatening to arm the Polish workers to resist the Soviets. However, Gomulka told Khrushchev that he had no intention of taking Poland out of the Warsaw Pact. He then agreed to leave Gomulka in power. Gomulka turned out to be a trusted ally of Khrushchev, and the freedoms given to the Poles in 1956 were gradually taken away. In the late 1970s, dissatisfaction with the poor economic situation in Poland resulted in industrial unrest, food shortages, and strikes. The opposition to the government centered on the port city of Gdańsk, and in 1980, the shipyard workers went on strike, which secured economic and political rights. This led to the establishment of the independent trade union movement called Solidarity. Solidarity gained a membership of 10 million people, which set it as a threat to the Soviet Union. The Red Army sent troops to the Polish border, but did not invade. Stanisław Kania, the new leader of Poland, convinced Brezhnev, who by then had taken the position of Khrushchev, that he could restore order himself. However, elements of the Polish army were used to seize control of the government in December 1981. The loyal General Wojciech Jaruzelski was installed as prime minister and declared martial law, banned Solidarity, and arrested thousands of activists. By 1983, the government was in control, but the economic problems remained. On a global scale, the Soviets' actions in Poland definitely helped to weaken détente. When Hungary became a challenge to Soviet control, Khrushchev had rose to power. It was in fact Hungary that showed how determined Khrushchev was to maintain Soviet control over the satellite states. After the Polish success, crowds in Hungary took to the streets and demanded that Matyas Rakowski, the current Communist Party leader, be replaced with more moderate communist Imre Nagy. Khrushchev agreed to this, but riots continued on. Khrushchev ordered the Red Army to restore control, but it failed to do so. Nagy announced that Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact and was going to become a neutral state. Although these threats were serious, Khrushchev's breaking point arrived when Nagy planned to share power with non-communist groups. Soviet forces launched a general offensive against the Hungarians. 20,000 Hungarians and 3,000 Soviet troops were killed, but the Soviets were able to bring Hungary back into Soviet control. Imre Nagy was executed and the new leader, János Kadar, was placed in power. The revolt had been encouraged by CIA broadcasts on Radio Free Europe, which led Hungarians to believe that they would get US support. However, the Americans assured the Soviet leader that they would not assist in the protection of Nagy. Eisenhower knew that Khrushchev might have been prepared to risk nuclear war rather than lose this specific satellite state. Also, the West was focused on the Suez Crisis and was not too focused on the turmoil that was occurring in Hungary. Khrushchev showed that destabilization did not mean a softening of the USSR's fundamental attitudes. The Communist Party was prepared to use whatever repression necessary to pull the satellite states back into line. In the 1960s, the dissatisfaction felt by the Czechs reached its peak. Alexander Ducek became the first secretary of the Communist Party in 1968, which marked the beginning of what was known as the Prague Spring. This was a period of political liberalization in Czechoslovakia towards a more modern and liberal system.
On the one hand, they wanted to preserve communism and socialism, as they called it. But on the other hand, they wanted to give it a human face, which meant that they wanted to lift the lid a little. But they hoped that the lid would not fly off with the pressure inside the cooker, as it were, that they would still be able to contain the situation.
Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and the members of the Warsaw Pact became worried, which encouraged the Soviet Union to resort to force. In August 1968, Soviet troops with other members of the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia and ended the Prague Spring. Prague was invaded and a new government was installed under Gustáv Husák, who was a subservient to Moscow. To justify his actions, Brezhnev released the Brezhnev Doctrine that states that when forces are hostile to socialist countries in the hopes to turn them capitalist, it becomes a common concern of all socialist countries. This made it clear that any attempt at liberalism would not be tolerated. The invasion of Czechoslovakia seriously damaged the international reputation of communism and the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, Albania, and China condemned the USSR's actions. Many communist countries stopped looking up to Moscow for guidance, and the détente process between East and West was slowed down. Although Khrushchev attempted to carry out de-Stalinization and improve his relations with the other Communist Party leaders in the satellite states, there was no fundamental change in the relationship that Stalin maintained between the Soviet Union and the satellite states. This became even more of a reality during Brezhnev's rule, since power remained centralized in Moscow and the economies of satellite states were developing in terms to suit the Soviet Union. The leaders of the satellite states remained loyal to Moscow, and when any states attempted to deviate from the situation, the Red Army came into action. It wouldn't be until Christmas Day 1991 when Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR that the Soviet Union would cease to exist.